I was about 17 when I realised that my mental health was not where it should be. Being at times kind of a stressor, actually it was also incredibly important as a release, just even on a hormonal basis.
So welcome everyone to the Mind.Set podcast. This is one of our Mind.Set and This Is Me collaborations where we're sitting down with various people. Today it's Anastasia. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And the purpose of this podcast is merging Mind.Set with This Is Me campaign and the Lord Mayor's appeal, and looking at people's journeys in their professional life and in the city around mental health. And perhaps a good place for us to start is just introducing yourself and letting us know a bit about what you do.
Sure, so I'm Anastasia Vinnikova. When I meet people for the first time, I like to describe myself as a mental health advocate who doesn't like having any spare time. Right. So my day job is in workplace wellbeing at the Mind Forward Alliance, but I'm also on the chair of the board of trustees for a very small mental health charity called Inspire. We help people have access to online therapies, and I sit on two lived experience committees for the Samaritans, who are the UK's leading suicide prevention charity. And like to get involved with lots of other mental health projects, including This Is Me. Yeah. So between all of that, I feel very passionate about the mental health space, but don't tend to have much spare time for anything else.
Yeah. And the Samaritans, but you just talked about there, the lived experience. So what's that, just out of interest? Is that effectively a group of people that volunteer to pass their message on, is it?
Yeah, so it's two separate committees. One of them looks at online safety, so essentially it's a group of people who have lived experience of self-harm or suicidal ideation or suicidal attempts, and they share their experiences and feedback on various aspects of project work that Samaritans are doing around trying to make sure that in the UK, the internet is as safe a place as possible for vulnerable people. Right. And the other committee is a subcommittee of their board looking at sort of strategic direction, research, external partnerships, just to make sure that the work that they do is rooted in the people essentially that they're serving.
Right. Interesting, very interesting. So you, in amongst all of that, you find time for hobbies or anything else, or is it just all give?
Yes, no, it's of course it's important to look after yourself as well. We have to practice what we preach with well-being. Indeed, so in what feels like another life, I used to be a competitive figure skater. So can't quite do it at that intensity anymore, but ice skating is very much a sort of safe space for me. So in the mornings before work, quite often you'll find me initially very cold in an ice rink and then very quickly warming up, and I love swimming as well. I find it's very kind of refreshing for the mind and for the body as well.
And touching on the ice skating and competitive figure skating, how did that feed into your journey and your story? At what age did you start to do that, and when do you remember that becoming a really big part of your life?
So I started skating when I was 4. So it was from, it's basically been my whole life. It's a very big part of who I am and has contributed a lot to who I've become, I think. It's a beautiful sport, but it's also very intense. It's a solo sport. It's an aesthetic sport. So I think it carries with it lots of challenges around, how you feel about yourself as you're growing up, and the competitive angle is great for performance and kind of setting high expectations for yourself. But I think it's easy for that to become quite an isolating feeling. So I think it was, definitely ups and downs throughout my sporting career. I love it. I wouldn't change a thing. But I think that now looking back on it, there were definitely moments where that drive to be the best is challenging psychologically and physically, and I wish that I had maybe kind of been a little bit easier on myself, I suppose, because I think when you set the bar so high, anything that falls short of that is really crushing. And I think it can really, I think it encouraged me to associate myself and my self-worth and kind of my contribution to the world to very narrow parameters of how you define success. It was you're the best or you're nothing. So I think it's given me kind of a significant work ethic and drive, but definitely kind of had to, as I was maturing and developing, had to look back on some of the kind of mindset that I think competitive sport can kind of put you in, and think about whether that was sustainable for kind of, you know, living life in a way that was sufficiently kind to myself. But I skated for a long time. I had lots of injuries, as you might expect, sort of flinging yourself around on ice. And when I was a teenager, I fractured my spine. So to be honest, although I carried on skating for a while after that, it was, you know, a bit of a kind of, that was the end point really, because I came back and I competed after that, but you're not quite the same. There's a fear, you know, kind of, it affects flexibility in your back. It healed okay, but you're never quite the same after something like that. So that was sort of a significant challenge to overcome as well. But now, you know, it's great to be able to be part of kind of the skating world in a different way.
That everything you just described around that kind of paradox between it being this beautiful kind of sport, but equally quite difficult and sounds like cruel at times, with this battle of, okay, it's this one finite small thing or nothing, almost your first or nothing. Where did that take you to in terms of what level of competitivism? And also, when do you remember the first time that you started to really go, oh, hold on, I don't know if this is actually right for me?
Yeah, so in terms of where I got to, so in figure skating in the UK, you kind of have levels that you go through. The top level is senior, and that's the level at which I was competing towards the end of my career. Never quite got to kind of Olympics stage, but I did compete internationally for GB. So yeah, it was definitely lots of proud moments and lots of wonderful opportunities to travel as well.
Yeah. What was the, do you remember there being a time when you kind of, do you know what, I'm not sure if all of those years exposing myself to such a high level of competitism has served me, you know, whether you start to go, actually, is this quite, you know, has this been quite a challenge for me mentally?
I think it's challenging because, you know, experiencing sport and a competitive career as you're transitioning through life and growing, you know, starting at the age of 4, skating was with me through so many kind of milestones and changes in my life. I don't know if there's kind of that one pivotal moment where I was like, hang on a second. And largely because I think it was quite entangled with kind of a mental health journey that I think I would have gone on regardless, that I think was brought about by lots of different things working together. And it was around the time that I was maybe 17 that I really started to realise that actually my mental health wasn't in a particularly good place. But it's hard to unpick what role sport played in that, because as well as being at times kind of a stressor, actually it was also incredibly important as a release, you know, just even on a hormonal basis. We know that, you know, exercise releases stress reducing hormones and mood lifting hormones, and I love the sport, so there was a lot of positive. So it's difficult, there wasn't kind of
there isn't one
but I was about 17 when I realised that my mental health was not where it should be.
I was having a conversation the other day, actually, and it was around a similar question, and the response was something to the ilk of, you know, actually I was going to get unwell regardless, similar to what you said. You know, it's not actually a specific thing, it's a particular mind or an overactive mind or whatever the, you know, thing is. And I think that was, when I heard that, I thought, actually, yeah, that was the case for me, you know. Whilst I had drinking and that became an issue for me, the stuff that's happened to me over the years I think would have happened in any event, because I now know myself well and I know what my mind was like, and I know I didn't have the tools to deal with it, etc. So it's interesting, although I would also say that sometimes it's very helpful to have things to anchor your illness or your challenges on, you know, which is what I found. So you alluded to at 17 was when you first started to experience. So what happened at 17, and how did that develop to what happened?
Yeah, so I mean, 17, I'm sure you remember, complex time. I was coming up to the end of school, I was about to sit my A-levels, and there's kind of all this expectation of what happens next and where do you go, and you have to start thinking about your career, and, you know, you're maybe not quite ready to know exactly what you want to do and choosing universities and things. And I think I really felt the weight of expectations, and I have a lovely support network around me. My family are incredible, great friends. You know, my school was quite supportive. But I think I was the one putting most of the expectations on myself and imagining that people around me would only value me in a certain way if I, you know, got certain grades or went to a certain university. And I think probably societally that can be a challenge. I think that I am definitely not alone in feeling that, you know, at that point, you know, you are only worth, you know, the name of the university that you can then kind of, you know, put on your CV. And I think it all just weighed too heavily on me, and I think I just remember having this moment and thinking, I really don't feel good. I feel hopeless, and I'm pretending most of the time when I'm, you know, smiling at people, or, you know, at social occasions, or even kind of, you know, I was finding it hard to engage on a day-to-day basis with things in my life that I used to engage with very easily. And I really remember looking around at other students, you know, my friends, my classmates, and everyone seemed fine. And so I couldn't understand why it was just me experiencing the world in this way, and all these worries and stresses about how were the exams going to go and what would happen next, and then what was my career going to be.
And interestingly, on that point, do you still think that now, looking back? Do you still think it was because that's interesting, is it the perception bit? It doubles down on what's going on. For sure. Head.
I mean, I think if anyone looked at me at that point, they would have said, oh, you know, she's happy, she's fine. And so, of course, it was, I suspect lots of us were feeling that way. It's just that nobody was talking about it, which is, you know, that's partly stigma, I guess. And that's why it's so important that, you know, things like This Is Me exist, and we do give people the platform to be able to talk about what they're going through. But 17 was longer ago than I would like to admit for me. And so kind of the landscape of society, I think, was quite different. And I went to a lovely school, but didn't really do anything about mental health. We didn't really learn about it. I don't remember there being kind of celebrities or, you know, kind of any social discourse around mental health. And so I remember quite distinctly my reference points were quite kind of Hollywoodized. I was kind of thinking straight jackets and padded walls, and that, you know, when you're feeling the weight of expectations about your future, the concept of imagining that, you know, if you talk about how you're feeling, then that's really going to kind of be the end of this, you know, bright future that you would like to envision for yourself. So I held off on seeking kind of any kind of support for a while, suppressed everything, and that went as well as, you know, you can imagine it when it doesn't work to just ignore it or try and deal with it by yourself.
I always use the analogy of, you know, the buoys at sea, and, you know, the harder you push down on them, the faster they come back up. That's what I always kind of associate with when I was also trying to do that. You know, and it's fascinating how that all kind of unravels and catches up with you. So what that journey that you started to go on and that you started to experience, where did it take you to? What was kind of the rock bottom of that journey?
So I didn't seek any. So I was around 17 when I kind of realised that, you know, I was having some problems. I suspect the symptoms are probably there before that. I just didn't really recognise them. And then it wasn't until I was in my second year of university that I actually sought help for the first time from a university counsellor, which was an incredible resource, and I'm very, very grateful to my university counsellor. If anyone with university students in their lives is listening to this, use those services. All universities have them. They are incredible. But you know, it took getting to a stage where I scared myself. So, you know, kind of as I was progressing through university, I was getting better at pretending that I was fine. And I think on the surface, it probably looked like I was really happy and everything was going fine and there was no cause for concern. But I really was sort of spiraling into a very dark place, a very kind of hopeless feeling. And I just... There were lots of moments where I wanted quite badly to stop feeling how I was feeling, and I couldn't see an exit route. And I think that kind of thinking takes you to a very distressing and a very dark place. And I also found that sort of my behaviours became quite controlling. So I had what I now kind of know was really severe anxiety, and so it was this catastrophizing, and so the smallest thing would spiral for me into, you know, something absolutely horrendous. And it was quite preventative, I think, from living life normally. And And again, kind of looking back on it with some, better knowledge and awareness around mental health now, what I also realise is I was very, very controlling and restrictive with my eating.
Right.
And I think that was just a desperate clutch at trying to get some control over this kind of anxiety and hopelessness that I was feeling. I couldn't control anything else, but maybe I could control kind of, what I was eating and what size I would be. And it just got to a point where all of this was so controlling and so impactful over my whole life that I really thought I need to speak to somebody about this. So I spoke to a really, really lovely counsellor, and she was very validating and supportive. But she did suggest that what I need to do is to get a diagnosis.
Right.
So I did, and that was bittersweet. I don't know if it was ever similar for you, but kind of having a label for what you're going through can be really validating. But also suddenly I felt like I had a label, I had this illness that was diagnosed, and so I suddenly was a mentally ill person. Again, kind of, my associations with that at the time were very stigmatized, very negative. And I was confused, and I felt guilty, and I felt ashamed. And there was a lot of guilt because nothing had happened. I hadn't had a horrible trauma that I felt would have justified how I was feeling. But of course it doesn't work that way, and everyone who experiences that, their experiences are valid, even if on the surface it looks like they have absolutely everything. So it was, it was a roller coaster, and I didn't immediately kind of get better. It's not like you go and you get your diagnosis and suddenly it's a miracle cure.
What was the diagnosis, if you don't mind me asking?
An anxiety disorder and depression.
Okay. Yeah. And the when you look back at the pretending everything's all right, I'm all right, what do you think the fear was that was driving you to continue to pretend, and then how did it feel once you no longer had to pretend?
So I guess I was afraid that people would judge me, that they might think that either I was weak for feeling how I was feeling, and why couldn't I just get on with it. But I also think that there was, kind of this fear of an element of judgment, I think, because there was all of this stigma. The stigma persists now, but I think it has, lots of work has been done to reduce it. But the stigma around mental illness, I think, means that it feels like you might be very othered if you express that, this is something that you're living with. And I think it did take me a while to tell people. So I had this diagnosis, I tried to go to therapy, dropped out of therapy quite a few times. I could never finish a full course. That's because I wasn't telling anyone, so I was doing it completely in secret.
So that felt like too much to carry.
And I couldn't keep coming up with excuses, why was I, where was I going, and why was I coming back, with red eyes and dishevelled, and, I don't know what people thought at the time that I was up to, but it was just too much to kind of bear on my own as a secret, so I kept dropping out. And it was actually very much thanks to the This Is Me campaign, the green ribbon portion of the This Is Me campaign that I encountered when I started working at the Bank of England, that sort of, I don't, not to be kind of too cheesy or cliche, but it really was a very pivotal moment for me, because I was in this, huge, important institution in the middle of the city of London, and there were so many people wearing green ribbons that were signalling kind of their commitment to ending stigma around mental health. I really felt for the first time that it was okay, and look at all these people that are signalling to me that it's okay, and odds are most of them will have direct or indirect experience with mental illness, and so, I really felt this sort of, we're in it together and I'll be accepted if I talk about this here. And so I opened up to my manager and to my team, and she was incredible. She's, really, she was a wonderful example of compassionate leadership, and, maintains sort of her inspirational hold over me, even to this day. But it encouraged me then to talk about my mental health in my personal life as well. So it wasn't just that, impact of kind of in the professional space, and told my friends and family for the first time. And it was an enormous relief, because I didn't have to pretend anymore, and I could be open with people about how I was feeling and why I was feeling, and it gave people permission to offer me support, and also for me to be able to articulate what kind of support was helpful, because obviously people, you know, need to be supported in different ways. And do
you think any of those fears came true that you had?
No. I really, you know, when I talk to people about the, you know, what happens when you open up about mental health, for me, 99% of the experiences have been that people have pleasantly surprised me. And, you know, I would like to believe that generally people at their core want to do good, and so, you know, revealing something that is difficult and painful, particularly with something like mental health, which is universal. We all have mental health. Statistically, we will know somebody, we will probably love somebody who is struggling with their mental health, and generally I think people do want to help and they do want to understand. And I find that if there are negative reactions, of which I've had very, very few, often it's where people don't understand, or, you know, education and awareness, I think, goes a really long way to helping people to respond better to kind of these kind of disclosures from others.
And how do you think all of that feeds into the modern kind of corporate or business world? How do you think the kind of gap is bridged between what you're describing and, because this is where I'd place what you're describing, and certainly my experience has been fairly at the critical end. But of course, it's a huge spectrum. And I think, I don't know what your thoughts are, but I think the raising awareness bit's really useful. And I think the awareness is largely there, or certainly getting there, if not already. And that can almost get to a point where it's too played out, or there's fatigue around it, because it's that end of the so to make it more accessible to people, how do you think the next step is, if the next step is this, to make it more accessible? How do you think that plays itself out? What's, you know, because the end goal, of course, is let's talk and be open, but actually how do we convert that into something that's really useful, I think? And that's some of the work you've been doing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and it's a good question. I don't know if I've got kind of a golden ticket answer, but I think fundamentally, I mean, even if I kind of take my own example, I became a much better worker the moment that I was able to be honest with my manager and my team about who I was, because you're spending less energy on pretending that everything's fine. And yes, you know, it meant I had to go to therapy appointments, but it really was kind of professionally a pivotal point for me. I wasn't just surviving and floundering around and kind of, you know, clutching onto my job. I began to thrive. My career really took off, and I really think that kind of, you know, platform was suddenly being able to be kind of free of the burden of the secrecy of what I was going through. And I think it relates to experiences, as you say, you know, we're talking about kind of one end of the spectrum, but it's everything. It's, you know, if you can be open about the fact that you had a really bad weekend, or you're feeling under the weather, or you know, something's happened at home and it's really stressing you out. I think it's giving people the option to be more of themselves in the workplace, to take away kind of the emotional and physical drain of trying to kind of, you know, hide things or try and power through or mask how you're feeling. How we make that accessible, I think, is you know, challenging. It has to be kind of at different levels of the organisation. I think you know, the silver lining of the pandemic, which obviously was horrible for so many reasons, is that research has really kind of increased in the workplace wellbeing space. And so now increasingly we have the evidence to say workplace wellbeing isn't this sort of fluffy, intangible thing that's nice to do, but it's good for productivity of employees. It's good for collaboration between employees. There's studies linking firm profitability to workplace wellbeing initiatives, obviously if they're successfully executed. So there's a business case, if that's the language that kind of, you know, senior leaders speak for managers. There's kind of the argument that your team is going to be able to work better together, and you're going to be able to understand the limitations and the possibilities of your team if you have the opportunity to kind of, you know, have this open environment. But I think a lot of that stems from role modelling. So I would love to see more senior leaders being open, and that doesn't mean that they have to share their deepest, darkest secrets with the world. But I think that there are ways to be more well-being and human-centric in our behaviours in the workplace. expressing what we're feeling, sharing the things that we do to look after ourselves, being open to giving and receiving constructive feedback, because everybody works in different ways, and you don't know how that's going to play out between each other if everybody's just pretending that, you know, this is all absolutely fine.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the evolution of the world that we're in, and certainly the city, and you look at AI, for example, and then you look at some of the events that I've gone to recently where people are talking about human-centered business more, and how those two worlds might exist, i.e. if you're focusing on human-centered business, it being one of the biggest areas of innovation almost in terms of how modern day professional service firms are dealing with themselves, and how actually getting ahead is by becoming human-centered and focused. Do you have any view on that? Is that something you've kind of come across?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI probably feels like the hot topic at the moment. I think, you know, my view is AI is complicated, but what I hope it will do is free up our time to do these human-centered things that only we can do, that, you know, hopefully machines aren't able to do just yet. You know, I think that the concept of human-centered workplaces is incredibly important, not just from the kind of internal perspective, but kind of, as you alluded to, the client perspective as well. You know, I think that it's incredibly valuable what you can get from other people, and the way that we trust and experience, you know, our interactions with other humans is also really important for kind of, you know, that business output. But I think that being human-centered as a workplace is incredibly complicated, because the demands of businesses stretch them so thin. You know, the reason that we're not, you know, that I think we've moved away from being human-centered workplaces, and we're trying to kind of bring it back into what it might have been, you know, a long time ago. It's not because people don't want to. I think it's because we've sort of ended up in these systems and structures and kind of grooves of working that don't enable the time. Everyone is time poor, and those kind of very human-centric practices are time consuming. And so it's, you know, what are you prioritizing in the organization, and what is your business strategy? What is the intended output? How does that align to the behaviors that you're asking your people to share? If your, you know, business strategy isn't in any way related to kind of being human-centric, it's a very hard ask then to say to your people, well, actually, we want you to exhibit these behaviours, because that's not aligned to actually what you're asking them to do and to produce for the organisation. But I've been very, I think, kind of encouraged by the movement around bringing kind of some of that humanity back into workplaces, because I think it's better for societies, but I think ultimately it will be amazing when we finally kind of see, you know, businesses that have been reluctant to accept it, that I think it is better for business. Yeah,
for sure. And when you look back on that whole period of time you've described, and I'm sure, like me, the journey continues, the plot thickens, there are still challenges ahead and everything else. Is there any particular lesson that you've taken with you that you look back on and go, do you know what, that was really powerful from that experience, that you've converted from that, what at the time would have felt like a really dark, negative experience, into a positive, enlightened experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it relates to what we were saying earlier, and it's that, you know, there was a time in my life where sharing my experiences or telling people what I was going through was so terrifying. You know, it was just unthinkable that I would, you know, talk about my mental health in, you know, any conversation, let alone kind of in a public space. But I really do think that, you know, people are more positively receptive to offering support than sometimes we might think. And regardless of whether you're diagnosed with a mental illness or you're just experiencing a period of poor mental health, which of course is possible for anyone, I think it puts you in this mindset of isolation, and that, you know, it closes you off, because it can encourage you to think that people won't care, or they won't support you, or they'll judge you for what you're experiencing. And really, I think most of the time people will pleasantly surprise you. So, you know, my takeaway is that openness and kind of what we might have historically described as vulnerability can definitely be a strength, and it can help to bring people together, and it can help, you know, sometimes that vulnerability is what you need to be able to enable people to help you out of the situation that you're in. So, you know, I think I definitely encourage people to open up and share whatever they're comfortable sharing, but I think it's beneficial for them, and it also helps us to build, you know, these networks of societies and communities, whether it's in the workplace or not, where it's okay to share whatever it is that you're going through.
Which is essentially formulating culture, isn't it? Because culture is, you know, what's happening and being said without it sort of happening and being said, or, you know, behind the scenes, not, you know, and that's where it becomes, you know, a very much a ground up job, and not a quick fix, as we've alluded to. In terms of your what you're doing today and your day-to-day life now, where do you think you sometimes still kind of fall short, and what do you do to manage that process? Because, you know, as I just alluded to, it's certainly not, you've been through this, box tick, now it's all, you know, it's easy plain sailing. How does that manifest yourself in your life today?
So, I mean, I think my biggest kind of mental health and well-being shortcoming probably is I definitely stretch myself too thin. So, as I said at the beginning, I don't like having any spare time. Yeah. Which is great, means that I get to do lots of different things, but it also means that it can be very easy to kind of start neglecting yourself. And as you all know, it's, you know, it can start with the physical things. So it's, you know, I don't go ice skating, or I don't go swimming, or I start to eat worse, or, you know, I cut down on sleep because there's just not enough hours in the day to do everything. And that catches up with you. And I think that it, you know, obviously contributes to your psychological state as well. And so you sort of start to kind of go into this decline. So I think that that's the biggest thing that I'm, you know, still hoping to work on, is that I can find myself in quite dark places, but very often it will be triggered by the fact that I'll just take on too much and kind of, you know, stop looking after myself. I think having kind of challenges with mental health is, for me, in any case, it's very much sort of a chronic condition. So sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, but it does take management. It does take kind of, my lifestyle does need to be shaped around the fact that I live with this condition, and it will be the same for people who live with physical health conditions that are chronic. You do have to build your life around it and be careful about kind of having those checks and balances in place to make sure that you don't get yourself back into, you know, that sort of low point and that crisis point. So it's you know, I'm still working on it. Yes, it's very much a journey, and it's up and down, and there are bad days and there are good days. But on the whole, you know, being open about it and, you know, kind of living very kind of, I think, authentically with kind of my mental health conditions also just means that I can ask for help when I need it, and I don't have to be worried about how people will respond.
Which is huge. It's huge. I find myself doing a similar thing with keeping myself quite busy, and I think there's a large element of that for me, which is it's sometimes just easier for me to be in stimulus than it is to necessarily have to face up to the day-to-day challenge of what's going on, why am I feeling X, and I'm hardwired in a way, you know, so that hardwiring, whilst you can kind of change those pathways a bit and form new habits, it's still ingrained in me. So, and then similar to what you're saying, I find if I don't carve out the time, I'm a bit like a petulant child when I have to do the things I need to do. You know, I wake up in the morning, I don't want to go and sit and meditate for 10 minutes and then go to but I do, and I feel better, you know, and it's so it's always a bit of a battle, but I've come to realize over time that actually that's okay, because that's part of my makeup. The point is there's always action I can take, which is an amazing thing. And the fact that there's even a solution to this stuff, when if you rewind back to 17 or just before you spoke to you kind of like, I don't know what you felt, you know, I felt hopeless. It was like, well, there's no way. There's no way through, and then you just start to discover, well, there is. I'm not the only one that's gone through this, and blah, blah, blah. So just in finishing off, if you were in a room full of 100 strangers, what piece of advice would you give them about how they live their lives?
Given that I've already shared a bit about my thoughts around kind of opening up and you know, talking to people about what you're going through, I think the other thing that I'd say probably ties back to, you know, some of the things that I learned going through my figure skating career, and then kind of, you know, experiencing some of those challenges at kind of age 17. And it's that I think we can be very focused on attaching our self-worth to quite kind of narrowly defined achievements or accomplishments. But actually, you know, our makeup and our contribution to society and to the people around us is so much more than that, and often it's quite intangible things. So I think I would encourage people to value themselves according to a much broader kind of set of criteria around who they are and how they make people feel, and all the wonderful things that they do that are, you know, beyond where did you go to school and what's your university and who are you working for at the moment. So I think that there is something that we're missing around how we value and validate people around us, and I would love to see people recognise more in themselves. I think we'd be a happier society if we did that. It certainly would.
And one mini extension question to that then: how do people go about learning to have the courage to do that? Because in my experience, the attaching yourself to an achievement, a name, a job title is all part of the managing system.
Yeah.
And the fear, the control. How did you learn, or how do you think other people can learn to have the courage to go, it's not just about that?
I mean, listen, it's definitely still a journey for me. Of course, I'm still kind of, you know, as you say, hardwired to think about it in those measures as well. I actually find that when you talk to people and you kind of offer an opportunity to explore, you know, whether it's a professional relationship and you're talking about, you know, what are the things that I do in the workplace that are, you know, contribute to the experience that you have in the workplace, very often it will be some of those kind of softer things.
Right.
So I think it's more communication and exploration around how do we impact different people, because our behaviours and you know, again, particularly in the workplace, the things that we choose to do have a significant impact on the experience that other people, whether they're more senior, less senior than us in the workplace, you know, the decisions we make have knock-on impacts on the people around us. And I think that there is something about opening more conversations around some of the softer skills and how they make people feel. And I think also just defining ourselves, you know, not just as a professional and then your personal life is kind of somewhere separate. It's, you know, look at the relationships you have with your friends. It's, you know, have you tried something new recently and was it a disaster, but did it make you feel good, and, you know, was it absolutely hilarious? So I think it's exploring our lives and our impact on other people in a slightly sort of more out of the box way, which I think can certainly contribute to then the success that we have in professional scopes as well.
So it's bringing it more into scope, isn't it? It's bringing it more into focus and going, actually, this is a kind of a factor to consider in the whole wider equation.
Yeah.
Anastasia, it's been really great. Really appreciate you coming.
Thanks. It's been an amazing conversation.
Thanks.